The snow hadn't stopped falling for 3 days. Somewhere under that white silence, a dog named Ranger lay curled beside a body the rescue team had already given up on. His wife had identified the coat. She had cried at the hospital. She had signed the papers. The man was dead, everyone agreed. Everyone except the dog. For 6 hours, Ranger refused to leave his side, refused food, refused warmth, refused to believe what every human around him had already accepted. As Q4 image prompts do. He blocked stretchers. He growled at strangers who tried to move his owner's body. He would not be pulled away, not by rope, not by command, not by the cold that was slowly numbing his own paws to the bone. And when the medics finally leaned down one more time, not because protocol told them to, but because one man's gut told him to check just once more, they found something impossible. A pulse. Faint. Fading. But there! This is the story of the dog who knew the truth before anyone else did, the wife who had already begun planning a funeral, and the husband who came back from the edge of death because one animal simply refused to stop loving him. The valley of Pinecrest Hollow had seen its share of hard winters, but nothing prepared its residents for the storm that rolled in on the second week of January. Weather stations 3 counties over had issued warnings days in advance, but in mountain country, warnings often arrived too late to matter. The snow doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for you to finish your coffee or kiss your wife goodbye or double-check the batteries in your radio. It simply comes, and by the time you understand its scale, you are already inside it. Daniel Reyes had lived in Pinecrest Hollow his entire life. He was 42 years old, built like the men in his family always seemed to be built, broad-shouldered, quiet, more comfortable with the sound of wind through pine trees than with small talk in crowded rooms. He worked for the Regional Forestry and Utilities Department, a job that took him up into the high ridges more often than most people would consider sane, checking power lines, clearing fallen branches, making sure the thin threads of electricity that kept mountain homes warm through winter didn't snap under the weight of ice. That morning, like 100 mornings before it, Daniel woke before sunrise. His wife, Maria, was already in the kitchen, the smell of coffee curling through the small house they'd built together 12 years earlier, back when they were young enough to believe that hard work alone could conquer any obstacle life put in front of them. Their daughter, Sophia, 7 years old with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, was still asleep down the hall, wrapped in blankets that seemed too big for her small frame. "You sure you need to go up there today?" Maria asked, not for the first time. She had asked some version of this question every winter morning for over a decade, and every winter morning, Daniel gave some version of the same answer. "Line's been flickering near the ridge trail for 2 days. If I don't check it now, we lose power to half the North Valley if this storm hits like they're saying." He kissed her forehead, the way he always did, quick and certain, like punctuation at the end of a sentence they'd been writing together for years. "I'll be back before dark. Promise." It was a promise he fully intended to keep. He had no way of knowing, standing in that warm kitchen with the smell of coffee and the sound of his daughter's soft breathing down the hall, that within 8 hours, his wife would be sitting at that same kitchen table, wrapped in his old flannel jacket, waiting for news that would break her heart in a way she had never imagined possible. Ranger was already waiting by the door when Daniel grabbed his gear. Ranger was a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois, a breed known for its intelligence, its loyalty, and its almost unsettling ability to read the emotional temperature of a room before anyone in the room had said a word. Daniel had trained him himself, not for competition or show, but simply as a companion for the long solitary hikes his work required. Over 4 years, the two had developed a kind of wordless communication, a look, a gesture, a shift in posture, that outsiders often found eerie in its precision. "Come on, boy," Daniel said, and Ranger fell into step beside him without needing to be told twice. The drive up to the trailhead took 40 minutes, winding along roads that grew narrower and more treacherous the higher they climbed. By the time Daniel parked the truck and began the hike toward the ridge, the sky had already taken on the strange gray-white color that longtime mountain residents recognized as a warning sign, not yet snowing, but heavy with the promise of it, pregnant with weather that hadn't decided yet how violent it wanted to be. For the first 2 hours, everything went according to plan. Daniel located the flickering line, diagnosed a loose connector likely caused by ice expansion, and began the careful process of securing it. Ranger, as always, patrolled a loose perimeter around him, sometimes trotting ahead to investigate a scent, sometimes simply sitting nearby, watching Daniel work with the patient attentiveness of an animal who had appointed himself guardian of this particular human. It was around noon when the wind shifted. Anyone who has spent real time in mountain country knows that shift. The way the air suddenly seems to hold its breath, the way the temperature drops not gradually but all at once, as though someone has opened a door to somewhere much colder. Daniel felt it before he saw it. A pressure change in his ears, a stillness that felt wrong, unnatural, the kind of quiet that mountain people learn to fear more than any loud warning. Then the snow came. It did not arrive gently. Within 20 minutes, visibility had dropped from what might have been half a mile to barely 10 feet in front of his face. The wind, which had been a background presence all morning, became a physical force, shoving against him with enough strength that he had to lean into it just to stay upright. Daniel had been caught in storms before, every experienced mountain worker had, but something about the speed of this one, the sheer violence of its arrival, told him this was different. He radioed in immediately. "Base, this is Reyes, I'm on the ridge trail near marker 7, storms hit hard and fast, visibility near 0, I'm heading back to the truck now, we'll check in at the next marker." The response crackled through, half lost in static. "Copy that, Reyes, storms worse than forecast, get to shelter if you can't make the truck, wheel." The transmission cut out. Daniel tried again. Nothing but static and wind. This was the last confirmed contact anyone had with Daniel Reyes for the next 18 hours. What happened next, pieced together later from Daniel's own fragmented memories and the evidence found at the scene, was this. Attempting to navigate back toward the trailhead through near-zero visibility, Daniel lost the marked path. The ridge trail, familiar to him in clear weather, became a maze of white in every direction, no landmarks visible, no way to orient himself except by instinct and the vague memory of which way felt like downhill. Ranger stayed pressed against his leg the entire time, occasionally pulling ahead and then circling back, a behavior Daniel would later describe as the dog trying to lead me somewhere, like he knew something I didn't. Whether Ranger was genuinely sensing a safer route or simply responding to his own instinct to seek shelter, the effect was the same. He guided Daniel, step by uncertain step, away from the exposed ridge and toward a cluster of old maintenance structures used decades earlier by logging crews, most of them collapsed or abandoned, but one, a small equipment shed half buried in a snowdrift, still standing, still capable of blocking at least some of the wind. It was inside the frame of that structure, fighting through a drift that had piled against the doorway, that Daniel's boot caught on a buried support beam hidden beneath the snow. He fell hard, his leg twisting beneath him at an angle that told him immediately, even through the adrenaline and cold, that something had broken. The pain was immense. But worse than the pain was the realization that followed it. He could not stand. He could not walk. He was miles from his truck, in a storm that showed no sign of slowing, with a fractured leg, dwindling daylight, and a radio that had gone completely silent. He dragged himself the remaining few feet into the shelter of the shed, using his arms, gritting his teeth against pain that made his vision swim. Ranger followed every inch of the way, never more than a foot from his side, occasionally pressing his nose against Daniel's face as though checking, again and again, that he was still conscious, still breathing, still there. Inside the shed, Daniel did everything he could remember from years of wilderness training. He assessed his injury as best he could in the DAC, packed snow against the swelling to reduce it, wrapped his leg as tightly as his supplies allowed, and tried, with hands already growing numb, to start a small fire using what dry material remained in the corners of the structure. The wind found its way through every gap in the walls, and his efforts at fire produced only a few minutes of weak flame before the wet, wind-driven air smothered it entirely. As the temperature continued to drop and the light outside faded into the particular darkness of a mountain storm at night, Daniel began to understand, with the clear-eyed honesty that sometimes accompanies genuine danger, that he might not survive the night. He thought of Maria. He thought of Sophia, asleep in her 2 big blankets, unaware that her father's life now depended on a broken radio, a stranger's chance discovery, and the body heat of a dog who refused to leave his side. "Stay close, boy," he murmured, his voice already growing slurred with the first creeping effects of hypothermia. "Stay close." Ranger did not need to be told twice. He pressed his entire body against Daniel's chest and stomach, positioning himself with an almost deliberate precision over the areas where core body heat mattered most, and there, in the freezing dark of a half-collapsed shed on an unnamed ridge, the two of them settled in to survive a night that neither of them was guaranteed to see the end of. Maria Reyes had a rule for herself, one she had developed over 12 years of marriage to a man whose job regularly took him into dangerous terrain. She did not allow herself to worry until there was a real reason to worry. Daniel was careful. Daniel was experienced. Daniel had weathered storms before and always come home. But by 4 in the afternoon, with the wind howling outside her windows and no word from him since his last radio check-in, that rule began to crack. She busied herself with small tasks, the kind of tasks that fill time without requiring real thought, folding laundry that didn't need folding, wiping down countertops that were already clean, checking on Sophia every 20 minutes even though the girl was perfectly content building a blanket fort in the living room, oblivious to the tension slowly filling the house. By 5, Maria called the forestry department directly. He checked in around noon, the dispatcher told her, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trained to avoid alarming families. Storm came in faster than expected. We haven't had contact since, but that's not unusual with radio interference in that terrain during heavy weather. Not unusual did little to comfort her. She hung up the phone and stood in her kitchen for a long moment, staring at nothing, feeling the particular helplessness of a person who understands a crisis is unfolding somewhere beyond their reach, somewhere they cannot go, cannot help, cannot do anything but wait. By 6, she called again. By 7, she called a third time, and this time, the dispatcher's tone had shifted, still calm, but with an edge of seriousness that told her more than his words did. "We've initiated a search," he said. "Conditions are making it difficult, but we've got a team assembling now." Maria sat down at the kitchen table. She did not cry, not yet. She simply sat, wrapped in Daniel's old flannel jacket, which she had pulled from the hall closet without quite deciding to, and waited. Sophia wandered in around 8, rubbing her eyes, asking where Daddy was, why he wasn't home for dinner, whether he was going to read her the chapter of her book he'd promised to read that night. Maria found herself performing a version of calm she did not feel, smiling in a way that felt like it cost something precious, assuring her daughter that Daddy's work sometimes took longer than expected, that he'd be home soon, that everything was fine. Everything was not fine. Maria knew this with the particular certainty of a wife who has spent over a decade learning to read her husband's patterns, and this, total radio silence for over 6 hours during a storm this severe, did not fit any pattern she recognized as safe. She called her sister, Elena, who lived 20 minutes away, and asked her to come sit with Sophia. She did not explain fully why. She did not need to. Elena arrived within 15 minutes, took one look at Maria's face, and simply hugged her without asking questions, the way sisters do when words would only get in the way. The search and rescue team searching the ridge that night faced conditions that even experienced mountain rescuers described afterward as some of the worst they'd encountered in years. Winds gusting over 50 miles per hour. Visibility measured in feet, not miles. Temperatures plunging well below zero once wind chill was factored in. Helicopter search, which might have covered the terrain far faster, was grounded entirely. No pilot could safely fly in conditions like these. Ground teams moved slowly, methodically, following the last known coordinates of Daniel's radio check-in and working outward in expanding search patterns, fighting for every mile against snow that seemed determined to erase any trace of a man who might be out there somewhere, freezing, waiting, hoping someone would find him before the cold finished what the storm had started. Maria did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table long after Elena had gotten Sophia down to sleep, long after the house had gone quiet except for the wind outside and the occasional crackle of the police scanner Elena had brought, tuned to the frequency the search team used. She listened to fragments of communication, coordinates, weather updates, terse exchanges between team members, piecing together a picture of a search that was struggling against conditions almost as dangerous for the rescuers as they were for whoever they were trying to rescue. Around 2 in the morning, she allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine what it might mean if they didn't find him. If the storm won. If Daniel, steady, careful, always comes home Daniel, became one of the names people spoke of in hushed voices for years afterward, a cautionary tale told to new forestry workers about how quickly the mountain can turn on you. She pushed the thought away as soon as it formed, but it left a residue, a coldness in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. By dawn, the storm had weakened enough for the search to intensify. Teams found the first solid evidence around 7 a.m., boot prints, partially filled with fresh snow but still visible, leading off the marked trail in a direction that suggested someone had become disoriented in the whiteout conditions. An hour later, they found something worse, a smear of blood on an exposed rock, dark against the white, and beside it, a torn piece of fabric that Maria, when shown a photograph later that day, would identify immediately as matching Daniel's jacket. Each discovery chipped away at whatever fragile hope remained. Maria felt herself being slowly hollowed out, emotion by emotion, as the hours passed and the evidence accumulated without resolution, Enough to confirm something terrible had happened, not enough to confirm whether Daniel had survived it. It was nearly 6 in the evening, over 24 hours after Daniel's last radio contact, when the call finally came. The search team that finally located the collapsed maintenance shed was led by Tom Alvarez, a 20-year veteran of mountain search and rescue who had seen more than his share of both miracles and tragedies over the course of his career. He would later describe the moment of discovery as one of the strangest of his professional life, not because of what they found, but because of how the scene refused, in its own way, to confirm what his experienced eyes initially told him. The team had been following a set of tracks, partly human, partly canine, that had been slowly filling with fresh snow but remained just barely visible under the clearing morning light. The tracks led away from the main trail, down a small ravine, and toward a cluster of structures that predated the current forestry department's records by decades, remnants of old logging operations largely forgotten by everyone except long-serving locals like Tom. When they reached the shed, half collapsed and buried under a drift that had accumulated against its northern wall, Tom's team member on point called out that she'd found something. Tom moved forward and saw, through the gap in the shed's broken doorway, a scene that made his stomach drop. Daniel lay on his side, unmoving, his skin an unnatural shade of pale that Tom recognized immediately from years of cold-weather rescues, the specific, bloodless white of severe hypothermia. His lips had taken on a bluish tinge. His breathing, if it existed at all, was so shallow that it produced no visible fog in the freezing air, a detail that in Tom's experience usually meant the worst. And pressed against him, refusing to move even as strangers approached, was Ranger. "My first red," Tom said later, in an interview he gave reluctantly, uncomfortable with the attention the story eventually brought him, was that we were too late. "I've done this job 20 years. I know what a body looks like when the cold's already won. And that's what I was looking at. Protocol in situations like this is clear, if brutal in its practicality. Rescue teams operating in extreme conditions must make rapid assessments, and resources, limited, precious, often life or death for the rescuers themselves in weather this severe, must be directed toward those with a realistic chance of survival. A rapid check for vital signs, done under pressure, in gloves, in wind, in failing light, is not always a perfect science." Tom knelt beside Daniel and performed what he described as a standard field assessment, checking for breath, checking for obvious pulse at the neck, watching for any response to stimulus. In the chaos of the moment, wind still gusting, other team members calling out updates, the urgency of a search that had already stretched over 24 hours, his initial check registered nothing. "No pulse," he said, projecting the words back to his team, already shifting mentally into the grim protocols that follow a body recovery rather than a live rescue. It was in that exact moment that Ranger did something that Tom would later say he had never seen a working dog do, not in 2 decades of encountering search and rescue animals, therapy dogs, and personal companion animals in crisis situations. Ranger stood, positioned himself directly between Tom and Daniel's body, and refused to move. It wasn't aggressive. Tom was clear about that in every retelling. It wasn't a bite, wasn't even a back in the traditional threatening sense. It was something closer to a low, continuous, desperate sound, somewhere between a growl and a whine, combined with a physical stubbornness that made it genuinely difficult for the team to reposition around him. "I've worked with plenty of dogs whose owners didn't make it," Tom said. "And there's a particular way a dog behaves when they understand, on some level, that their person is gone. It's a kind of stillness, almost a resignation. This wasn't that. This dog was fighting. He was fighting us like we were the threat, like we were the thing trying to take Daniel away, instead of the people trying to help him." One of the younger team members, a rookie named Jess who had been on the job less than a year, later admitted the moment unsettled her deeply. "I remember thinking, this dog knows something we don't. I know that sounds crazy. I know dogs can't diagnose hypothermia. But I've never felt so certain that an animal was trying to tell us we were wrong." Standard procedure, faced with a body showing no detectable vital signs in extreme field conditions and a search operation already stretched to its limits, would have been to begin recovery protocols, treating the situation as retrieval of remains rather than an active rescue, redirecting the team's remaining energy and resources towards safely extracting themselves and the body from a still dangerous environment before conditions worsened again. Tom Alvarez, standing in that half-collapsed shed with a dog refusing to let him near the man he'd just declared dead, made a decision that he would later say was less about protocol and more about something he couldn't fully explain, even to himself. "I don't know exactly what made me check again," he said. Maybe it was 20 years of instinct telling me something didn't add up. Maybe it was just that dog. But I got back down on my knees, and I told my team to give me one more minute before we did anything. Tom Alvarez had learned, over 2 decades in mountain rescue, that severe hypothermia is one of the most deceptive conditions a first responder can encounter. Textbooks describe it in clinical terms. Core body temperature dropping below 95 degrees Fahrenheit is considered hypothermic. Below 82 degrees Fahrenheit is classified as severe or profound. But the lived reality of encountering a severely hypothermic patient in the field is far stranger and more unsettling than any textbook conveys. At extreme low body temperatures, the human body enters a kind of protective shutdown. Heart rate slows dramatically, sometimes to just a handful of beats per minute. Breathing becomes so shallow it may produce no visible movement of the chest, no fog in cold air, nothing a rescuer glancing quickly can reliably detect. Pupils can become fixed and unresponsive. Skin takes on the pale, waxy appearance typically associated with death. In extreme cases, patients have been found with body temperatures so low that standard equipment failed to register any vital signs at all, and yet, hours later, after careful, controlled rewarming, those same patients opened their eyes. Mountain rescue physicians have a saying for this phenomenon, grim but practically accurate: nobody is dead until they are warm and dead. It reflects a hard-won understanding that the appearance of death and the reality of death are not always the same thing when extreme cold is involved, that a body can look, by every quick visual and tactile measure, like it has already lost its fight, while some faint, fragile spark of life still persists underneath. This was the knowledge that made Tom Alvarez kneel back down beside Daniel Reyes for a second, more careful assessment. He removed one glove, a decision that cost him feeling in his fingers for the better part of the next hour, given the temperature, and pressed 2 bare fingers deep into the side of Daniel's neck, searching for the carotid artery with the kind of deliberate precision he reserved for moments when he genuinely wasn't sure what he would find. He held his position, unmoving, timing the check against the second hand of his watch rather than trusting his instinct alone, because instinct, in conditions this extreme, could not always be trusted. 10 seconds passed. Nothing. 20 seconds. Still nothing. Or at least nothing Tom could confidently identify as a pulse rather than the phantom sensation of his own cold-numbed fingertips. Around the 30-second mark, just as he was beginning to accept that his original assessment might, after all, have been correct, he felt it, the faintest possible flutter, barely distinguishable from nothing at all, but present, rhythmic, unmistakably a pulse. "I actually said it out loud before I fully processed it," Tom recalled. "I just said, 'He's got a pulse,' and for a second nobody moved, like they thought they'd misheard me." Then the entire scene shifted from recovery to rescue in a matter of seconds. Tom shouted instructions, and his team, trained for exactly this kind of rapid pivot, moved with practiced urgency. They radioed ahead to base, upgrading the situation from body recovery to active hypothermia rescue, requesting an ambulance be staged at the nearest accessible road point and alerting the regional hospital to prepare for incoming severe hypothermia protocols. They worked quickly but carefully to package Daniel for transport, aware that severely hypothermic patients require extremely gentle handling. Rough movement can trigger fatal cardiac arrhythmias in a heart already destabilized by extreme cold, a phenomenon rescue teams grimly refer to as rescue collapse. They wrapped him in layers of insulating material, careful to keep him horizontal, careful to avoid any sudden jarring movement, careful in a way that reflected the fragile, uncertain nature of the life they were now trying desperately to preserve. Ranger, throughout this entire transformation from despair to urgent hope, made a sound that Jess, the rookie team member, described as unlike anything she'd heard from a working dog before. Somewhere between a whimper and something that genuinely sounded like relief, like he'd been holding something in and finally let it out. As the team began the difficult mile-long trek back toward the extraction point, navigating the same treacherous terrain that had nearly claimed Daniel's life less than 24 hours earlier, Ranger walked beside the stretcher the entire way, never more than a few inches from Daniel's hand, occasionally pressing his nose briefly against exposed skin as though continuously checking, reassuring himself that what he had fought so hard to make the humans believe was actually, finally, being taken seriously. "I've thought about that moment a lot since," Tom said later. "About how close we came to walking away. About what would have happened if that dog hadn't made it so hard for us to leave. I'm not a superstitious man. I don't believe animals have some mystical sixth sense about death. But I believe that dog sensed something, warmth, breath, a heartbeat too faint for my fingers but not too faint for his senses, and I believe if he hadn't fought us the way he did, we would have made a decision that day we could never have taken back. By the time the ambulance carrying Daniel Reyes reached Pinecrest Regional Hospital, his core body temperature had been measured at 82.4 degrees Fahrenheit, a reading that placed him firmly in the category of severe, profound hypothermia, a condition where the boundary between life and death becomes, in a very real medical sense, ambiguous. Dr. Elena Cho, the attending emergency physician on duty that evening, had specialized training in wilderness and cold weather medicine, a relatively rare specialization that would prove crucial in the hours that followed. She understood, in a way that general emergency physicians sometimes do not, that a patient arriving in Daniel's condition required an entirely different treatment paradigm than a typical cardiac or trauma case, one centered around slow, careful, controlled rewarming rather than the aggressive, rapid interventions used in most emergency scenarios. Rewarming a severely hypothermic patient too quickly can actually be fatal, Dr. Cho explained later, in an interview given partly to correct public misunderstandings about the case, and partly because she felt a responsibility to help other medical professionals learn from what had happened. The body's chemistry changes at extreme low temperatures. If you warm the extremities too fast, you can send a rush of cold, acidic blood back to the heart, which can trigger fatal arrhythmias. It's a delicate, patient process. It can take hours, sometimes longer, to bring a patient like Daniel back to a stable temperature safely. While Dr. Cho and her team began the careful, methodical process of rewarming Daniel using warmed core fluids, heated blankets, and continuous cardiac monitoring, a separate and devastating breakdown was occurring elsewhere in the hospital's communication chain, one that would compound an already traumatic day for Maria Reyes in a way that nobody involved could have anticipated or intended. In the initial chaos of the field rescue, an early radio transmission from the search team, sent in the moments immediately following Tom Alvarez's first, mistaken assessment, before his second check revealed a pulse, had described the situation using language that, in the rescue team's internal terminology, indicated an unresponsive individual with no detected vital signs. This transmission, intended as a preliminary field report rather than a final medical determination, was relayed through several intermediaries before reaching the hospital's family liaison office. Somewhere in that chain of relayed information, crucial context was lost. The distinction between no vital signs detected in initial field assessment and confirmed deceased, a distinction that mattered enormously to trained medical and rescue personnel but could easily blur in rapid, stressful communication between multiple parties, collapsed into a single, devastating message. The family liaison, a well-meaning hospital employee named Grace Whitfield who had delivered difficult news to families many times before and took the responsibility seriously, received what she believed was a confirmed report. A man matching Daniel Reyes's description had been found by the search team with no detectable vital signs. At approximately 6:15 p.m., roughly 4 hours before Dr. Cho would successfully stabilize Daniel's cardiac rhythm in the hospital's controlled rewarming unit, Grace Whitfield called Maria Reyes to deliver news that she believed, with full sincerity and no intention of causing unnecessary anguish, to be true. "I need you to know that I have never made a mistake like that before, in 11 years of doing this job," Grace said later, her voice breaking during the interview as she recounted the call. "I believed what I was telling her. I had no reason to doubt the information I'd been given. And I will carry the weight of that call for the rest of my life, even though everyone has told me it wasn't truly my fault." Maria Reyes remembers very little of the specific words used in that call. What she remembers is the sensation, a kind of falling, a physical collapse of the world she had known just moments before, the floor beneath her feet no longer feeling solid. "I remember my knees just giving out," Maria said. "I remember sliding down against the kitchen counter until I was sitting on the floor, and I remember my sister rushing in because she heard the sound I made, and I don't even know what sound that was. I've never made a sound like that before or since." In the hours that followed, hours during which, unbeknownst to her, Dr. Cho's team was successfully, carefully, painstakingly bringing Daniel's body temperature back up toward a range where his heart could stabilize, Maria began the terrible, practical business that follows a death. She called family members, her voice hollow, mechanical, repeating words that felt unreal even as she spoke them. She asked her sister to help her think through arrangements. She sat with her daughter, 7 years old and utterly bewildered by her mother's grief, and tried, through her own shattering heart, to find some way to explain that Daddy was not coming home, not that night, not any night. "I remember trying to figure out what dress I would wear," Maria said. "I remember thinking about which suit of his I should bring to the funeral home. These are things you think about when you believe, completely, that the person you love is gone. Your mind starts doing terrible, practical things, almost like a defense mechanism, while your heart is somewhere else entirely, screaming. She did not yet know that 8 miles away, in a hospital room lit by the steady, patient glow of cardiac monitors, her husband's heart had just begun, faintly but unmistakably, to strengthen. For nearly 4 hours, two entirely separate and contradictory realities existed simultaneously, separated by nothing more than a hospital corridor and a communication error that nobody had yet discovered. In one reality, Daniel Reyes was dead, and his wife was already moving through the terrible, disorienting rituals of grief, making phone calls she never imagined having to make, receiving the first waves of sympathy from neighbors who had somehow already heard, staring at a dining table suddenly crowded with casserole dishes brought by people who meant well but whose kindness felt, in that moment, like a physical weight Maria could barely stand to bear. In the other reality, inside Pinecrest Regional Hospital's specialized rewarming unit, Dr. Elena Cho and her team worked with a controlled, focused intensity that belied the emotional stakes of what they were doing. They monitored Daniel's core temperature rising in careful increments, 84 degrees, then 85, then 86, watching cardiac rhythms on the monitor with the specific vigilance required when a heart, still fragile from extreme cold exposure, could theoretically destabilize at any moment during the rewarming process. There's a strange kind of tension in cases like this, Dr. Cho explained. You're hopeful, because every degree you gain is progress, but you're also acutely aware that the danger doesn't disappear just because the patient is warming up. In some ways, the rewarming period itself carries its own risks. You can't relax. You can't celebrate too early. You just have to keep watching, keep adjusting, keep doing the careful work, one small increment at a time. Outside the hospital, in the ambulance bay where he had first been brought in, Ranger refused every attempt by rescue volunteers to move him to a veterinary triage area for his own care, despite showing clear signs of exhaustion and mild frostbite on his paw pads from the extended exposure. A volunteer named Carla Diaz, who had been assisting with animal care during the rescue operation, eventually made the decision to simply let Ranger stay where he was, lying just outside the ambulance bay doors, facing them directly, utterly still, in a posture that Carla later described in terms that struck a chord with everyone who eventually heard the story. He wasn't restless. He wasn't pacing or whining anymore, not like he had been on the mountain, Carla said. He was just watching those doors like he was standing guard over something. Like he knew, on some level, that the truth was still being decided in there, and he wasn't going to leave until he knew for certain. A nurse named Patricia Owens, who passed through the ambulance bay several times that evening while transporting supplies between departments, found herself increasingly struck by Ranger's behavior. In an interview given to a local news outlet weeks later, an interview that would eventually help the story spread far beyond Pinecrest Hollow, she offered an observation that would become, in many ways, the emotional heart of the entire narrative. That dog never once acted like his owner was gone, Patricia said. Not for a second. Every instinct I have, every bit of professional experience I have, tells me that animals grieve differently than we do, but they do grieve, and they show signs when they believe loss has occurred. This dog showed none of those signs. He was alert. He was watchful. He looked, more than anything, like he was waiting, not mourning, waiting. And it unsettled me, honestly, because it was like he knew something we didn't. Meanwhile, back in the Reyes household, Maria's sister Elena had taken on the quiet, heartbreaking task of helping manage the practical aftermath of devastating news, fielding phone calls, accepting the well-meaning casseroles and flowers that had begun arriving, gently steering Sophia toward bed despite the girl's confused, persistent questions about why everyone was crying, why nobody would tell her clearly what had happened to her father. Maria herself had reached a state that she would later describe as a kind of numb exhaustion, past the point of active crying, sitting in a strange, hollow stillness that felt less like peace and more like her body simply running out of capacity to feel anything more intensely. It was in this state, sitting at her kitchen table, still wrapped in Daniel's flannel jacket, staring at nothing in particular, that Maria heard a car pull into her driveway around 9:40 p.m. She assumed, given the hour, that it might be a family member arriving to offer support, or perhaps someone from the funeral home her sister had already begun contacting. She had no way of anticipating that the person walking up to her front door was about to deliver news that would upend her grief as thoroughly and completely as the original call had upended her happiness just hours earlier. Grace Whitfield had made the decision, Once Dr. Cho confirmed to the hospital's administrative team around 9:15 p.m. that Daniel Reyes had achieved a stable cardiac rhythm and was responding well to continued rewarming treatment, that this correction could not be delivered over the phone. I had made the mistake by phone, Grace said. I wasn't going to compound it by delivering something this significant, this delicate, the same impersonal way. I needed to be there, in person, to see her face, to be ready to catch her if she needed catching, in whatever way that meant. She drove to the Reyes home herself, arriving at approximately 9:40 p.m., her hands, by her own admission, shaking on the steering wheel the entire way, rehearsing words that felt inadequate no matter how she arranged them. When Maria opened the door, dressed, Grace would later recall with a specific ache, in a simple black dress she had apparently already changed into, her eyes swollen from hours of crying, her face carrying the particular exhausted stillness of someone who has moved past acute grief into something more numb and enduring, Grace found herself, for a moment, unable to find any words at all. I just said it, Grace recalled. I didn't build up to it gently, because I realized in that moment that there was no gentle way to say what I needed to say, and every second I hesitated was a second she remained in unnecessary pain. I just said, Maria, I need to tell you, Daniel is alive. Maria has described, in the various interviews she gave in the months following, that the sensation of hearing those words landed with an impact that in some ways felt even more overwhelming than the original news of his death. Grief, when it arrives, is terrible, but it has a kind of logic to it, even in its devastation, Maria explained. Your mind starts to organize around it, even as it breaks you. But joy arriving that suddenly, that violently, after you've already surrendered to loss, that doesn't have the same logic. My body genuinely didn't know what to do with it. I remember my legs simply stopped working. I don't remember deciding to fall, I just remember being on the floor, and my sister rushing over, and Grace kneeling down beside me, both of them saying my name. For several long moments, Maria has admitted, she was unable to fully process or believe what she was being told, her mind caught in a kind of protective disbelief after having already absorbed and accepted the devastating alternative just hours earlier. I kept asking her, "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure this time?" Maria recalled. Because I had already believed one impossible thing that day, and I didn't know if I could survive believing something impossible again only to have it taken away. Grace, understanding the depth of the trauma her earlier call had inadvertently caused, stayed with Maria for nearly 20 minutes, walking her through exactly what had happened, the confusion in the field communication, Dr. Cho's careful rewarming process, the stable cardiac rhythm now being monitored, the realistic but genuinely hopeful prognosis for Daniel's recovery, until Maria was able to absorb enough of the information to begin functioning again, however shakily. I have never driven so fast to a hospital in my life, Maria said, describing the moments after Grace's visit. And I have never in my life felt so many emotions fighting each other inside my chest at the same time, relief and disbelief, and this strange, guilty grief still lingering from hours of genuinely mourning him, all crashing into each other. Elena stayed behind with Sophia, who had fallen asleep during the earlier hours of confusion and distress, while a neighbor who had come by to offer support insisted on driving Maria to the hospital herself, correctly assessing that Maria's hands, still trembling uncontrollably, were in no condition to safely operate a vehicle. The 20-minute drive to Pinecrest Regional Hospital felt, according to Maria, both impossibly long and impossibly short, long in the sense that every red light, every moment of delay, felt unbearable given what awaited her, short in the sense that she barely remembers the actual passage of time, her mind consumed entirely by a single, overwhelming need to see her husband, to touch him, to confirm with her own eyes and hands what she had been told over a doorway conversation that still felt, in some deep part of her, too fragile and impossible to fully trust. Maria arrived at Pinecrest Regional Hospital shortly after 10 p.m., rushing through the emergency entrance with an urgency that hospital staff, familiar with the particular energy of family members racing toward news both terrible and hopeful, recognized immediately and moved to accommodate. She was met by Dr. Cho herself, who took a few crucial moments, despite the ongoing demands of monitoring her patient, to walk Maria through Daniel's condition in clear, careful terms, preparing her for what she would see before allowing her into the rewarming unit. I wanted her to understand what she was walking into, Dr. Cho explained. Severe hypothermia patients, even ones who are stabilizing well, don't look like someone who's simply had a bad day. There are tubes, monitors, a pallor to the skin that can look alarming if you're not prepared for it. I didn't want her first moments with him to be dominated by fear or shock. I wanted her to be able to actually be present with him. When Maria was finally led into the rewarming unit, she found Daniel lying in a hospital bed surrounded by monitoring equipment, warming blankets, and 4 lines delivering heated fluids designed to continue the careful process of restoring his body to a stable temperature. His skin remained pale, though no longer carrying the alarming bluish tinge that had marked him hours earlier on the mountain. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady and visible now, rising and falling with a rhythm that Maria has described as the single most beautiful thing she has ever witnessed. "I have heard people talk about sounds that changed their lives," Maria said. "For me, it was the sound of that heart monitor, that steady, rhythmic beeping. I stood there and just listened to it, and it felt like the most important music I had ever heard in my entire life." She approached the bed slowly, almost reverently, and took Daniel's hand, carefully, mindful of the 4 lines, mindful of the fragility Dr. Cho had described, and simply held it, feeling the warmth gradually returning to fingers that, hours earlier, rescue workers had found dangerously, frighteningly cold. Daniel, though not yet fully conscious, later described a vague awareness during those early hours of stabilization, not clear memories, but fragments, sensations. He remembers, he says, a sense of warmth returning gradually, of voices nearby that felt reassuring even before he could fully process their words, and, distinctly, the sensation of a familiar hand holding his own. "I don't remember opening my eyes and seeing her clearly, not at first," Daniel said, describing his recollection of that night in later interviews. "But I remember somehow knowing she was there. I've thought about that a lot since, how the body and the heart seem to know things sometimes before the mind fully catches up." Outside the rewarming unit, hospital staff, moved by the extraordinary circumstances of the case and the role Ranger had played in the rescue, made an exception to standard hospital policy regarding animals in patient care areas. After consulting with Dr. Cho, who recognized both the emotional significance and the potential calming benefit for her patient, staff arranged for Ranger, who had remained faithfully positioned outside the ambulance bay for hours, refusing to leave despite his own exhaustion and mild frostbite, to be brought briefly into the rewarming unit, wrapped in a thermal blanket of his own. His paws treated for the minor frostbite he had sustained during his hours of unwavering vigil. When Ranger was brought into the room and set down gently near the bed, hospital staff present that night described a moment that several of them said they would remember for the rest of their careers. Ranger did not back. He did not jump, did not show the excited, uncontained energy one might expect from a dog reunited with an owner after such an ordeal. Instead, he approached the bed slowly, almost deliberately, and rested his head gently against the edge of the mattress, positioning it as close to Daniel's hand as the equipment allowed, and then simply stayed there, motionless, patient, present, for the better part of an hour. It was like watching him finally allow himself to exhale. Patricia Owens, the nurse who had earlier described Ranger's vigil outside the ambulance bay, said, 4 hours, that dog had been holding himself in this state of tension, this refusal to accept what everyone around him believed. And in that moment, with his head resting against that mattress, you could see it, the moment he finally let himself rest, because he finally, truly believed it was safe to. Maria, sitting beside the bed with one hand holding Daniel's and the other resting gently on Ranger's head, has said that the image of the 3 of them together in that quiet hospital room, her husband breathing steadily, her dog finally at peace, herself caught between exhaustion and overwhelming gratitude, remains, even now, the moment she returns to whenever she needs to remember what it feels like to have something precious taken away and then, impossibly, miraculously, given back. Nearly a year has passed since the storm that nearly took Daniel Reyes's life, and the family has, in the time since, worked steadily to rebuild a sense of normalcy around an experience that fundamentally reshaped how each of them understands life, loss, and the fragile boundaries between the two. Daniel made what his medical team describes as a remarkably full recovery, given the severity of his condition upon arrival at the hospital. He required several weeks of continued treatment for the fractured leg sustained during his fall, along with ongoing monitoring for potential long-term effects of the severe hypothermia and frostbite he experienced. Today, his primary lasting physical effect is a lingering nerve sensitivity in several fingers, a result of the frostbite that developed during his hours of exposure, a minor but constant reminder, he says, of just how close the outcome came to being entirely different. He returned to work with the forestry department in the spring, several months after his rescue, though not without significant changes to department protocol that emerged directly from a formal review of his case. The department has since implemented stricter storm monitoring procedures, mandatory check-in intervals reduced from hourly to every 20 minutes during active severe weather warnings, and expanded training for all field workers on early recognition of rapidly developing storm conditions in the ridge terrain. I don't think anyone could have predicted that storm's speed, not with the information we had that morning, Daniel said, reflecting on the changes. But I'm grateful that something good came out of what happened to me, that other workers going forward will have better protections because of what our team learned. Ranger, meanwhile, has become something of a local celebrity in Pinecrest Hollow, a status he seems, according to Maria, entirely unbothered by and largely uninterested in. What has not changed, and what Maria says she has no intention of ever trying to change, is his absolute refusal to let Daniel leave the house for any significant outing without him. He used to be content staying home sometimes, especially in bad weather, Maria said, laughing gently. Now, if Daniel even reaches for his boots, Ranger is at the door before he's finished tying the first lace. I understand it completely. I don't think either of them ever wants to risk being separated like that again. The family has taken the unusual step, in the months since the story gained wider attention, of speaking at several local schools and community events about hypothermia awareness, wilderness safety, and the genuine, scientifically grounded value of canine search and rescue training, hoping, as Maria has explained in several of these talks, that sharing their story honestly and carefully might help even one other family avoid the specific, agonizing kind of confusion and grief that their own family endured during those 4 terrible hours between devastating news and its correction. Grace Whitfield, the hospital liaison whose earlier mistaken call had caused Maria such profound and unnecessary pain, has remained in contact with the Reyes family in the time since, and Maria has been notably, deliberately generous in how she discusses that difficult chapter of the story in public settings. I understand people want a villain in a story like this, someone to be angry at, Maria said. But I refuse to let that be Grace. She was doing her job, working with information she had every reason to trust, in an incredibly high-pressure situation. What happened to her that night, having to deliver news like that and then have to correct it hours later, must have been its own kind of nightmare. I've forgiven her completely, and honestly, I'm grateful she had the courage to come tell me herself, in person, rather than over the phone. That mattered more than she probably knows. Sophia, now 8 years old, has grown into what her parents describe as an almost fierce protectiveness over Ranger, understanding, in the particular clear-eyed way that children often grasp profound truths more directly than adults, that her father is alive today specifically because a dog refused to give up on him. When asked, in a recent interview, what she most wants people to take away from her family's experience, Maria did not speak about miracles, or fate, or anything resembling the mystical framing the story had occasionally been given as it spread online. She spoke, instead, about her dog. Ranger didn't need a pulse to know Daniel was still there, Maria said, her voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone who has told this part of the story many times, and yet still feels its full weight every time she says it. He just knew, on some level none of us can fully explain, that the man he loved wasn't gone. And because he refused to give up, because he made it so difficult, so impossible, for the people around him to walk away, none of us had to say the goodbye we thought we were going to have to say that day. We got to keep him instead. And there isn't a single day that goes by that I don't remember exactly how close we came to a different ending, and exactly what, and who, is the reason we didn't have to live it.